Thank you, everyone, for coming back. I know it's been a long day already. We have about an hour, a little less than an hour left. I don't know if people have had a chance to look over the recommendations some more, to think about if there's any that people would prefer discussing now rather than online. It had been my plan originally to take on recommendation number 2 next and then move on to questions about Stockpile. But there have been some discussions in the room and to me about some of the recommendations that maybe can be quickly dispatched. So if you don't mind, I'd like to scroll to recommendation 7. So just to put it in context, this recommendation touches upon how can we assemble a stockpile and make it work. And we invited Brian Blicken to join us because the working group, while we were discussing this recommendation, said maybe it's a good idea if we can work to extend the stockpile. Extend the outdates of items so that we can have a more efficient stockpile. After Brian's presentation, I had an interesting conversation with some people in the room, pointed out some fairly important economic factors involved here and human nature factors involved here. So, Ray, would you mind sharing your comments with the room?
No, I'd be happy to. And I think Lou and I have also exchanged some discussions on this. The capacity to hold material in a stockpile kind of situation for an extended period of time is not necessarily the most prime issue. You could turn that stockpile over probably every 180 days, as an example, and that would be on the preferable side. I'm sitting, from the standpoint of an industry to be able to do that. What you hear are a lot of reasons why it would be expensive to do this, to extend it one more year, for example. It would be, and so the call is to reduce the criteria of what it would take to make those changes. I don't agree with that. I think that the criteria that FDA and other organizations have for assuring the safety and efficacy of those products are important. And so if you're not going to reduce that, then where is the incentive to increase the shelf life of those products? And is it really necessary to increase the shelf life of those products in order to have an effective stockpile? If it comes down to a production capacity, that's probably more likely to be the issue, the thing that's going to limit you relative to having materials that are ready to go. And I think as evidence that I would point to in terms of there not being an economic incentive on the part of manufacturers, I don't want to speak for them, I just speak from my experience and my own personal side of things, is that if there were an advantage to doing it, they'd already be doing it. They'd already, if you could charge $3 more for a bag, they would probably be doing it. If you could gain 20% more of the market, they probably would be doing it. But the fact that those incentives don't actually exist makes it a very tough proposition, which I think it's unlikely to be able to move forward in an effective way. That's my personal opinion.
Jed?
I think it's a great question for Andre Kapp, because the one clear place where it would absolutely make sense is military deployments where they need to have these bags sitting in remote areas. So this would be a great discussion between BARDA and the manufacturers.
Actually, this recommendation originated with people from BARDA. So I'm not surprised. What does the committee think in terms of continuing with this, given Ray's discussion, which I thought was compelling? What does the committee think in terms of maintaining this recommendation? And no, I'm not asking for wordsmithing yet. I'm just asking as a whole.
I would recommend that we hold this for a later date and evaluate after we get our arms around what their actual manufacturing capacity can be, and what incentives could be brought to the fore to increase their manufacturing capacity.
I would second that.
Any other questions? Sally.
Yeah, I agree with Ray. And actually, we have a 6 month to a 1 year stockpile of reagents for testing that we hold in the manufacturer's warehouses. So we actually have been doing this for quite some time. And so I think that he has a good point about working with the manufacturers to do this. And this can be handled through contracting. So I would hold this for right now because I think there are too many questions to put this forward.
Fair enough, especially since we're on a limited time at the moment. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Lynn, please.
Oh, no additional comments, just to say I concur with the recommendation to table this particular item at this time.
Jim, do we need a vote to table this for now on the record, or can we just?
No formal vote is needed because we aren't moving it forward or asking that we delayed. It can be tabled.
Okay, then let's move on, and there will be further discussion about this in the virtual world. Nicole Verb-Dunn has specifically asked me to bring forward another recommendation, but she needs to be in the room, and she will be back here at 12:30. So if possible, I'd like to interrupt whatever we're doing when she comes back to discuss recommendation. Sorry. There are a lot of recommendations. Recommendation 9 will be discussed at 12:30 when Nicole is available. So until then, what I'd like to do is turn to the beginning of the recommendations on Stockpile, because I think that's a very complicated issue. Susan helped me to see how complicated it was. We would probably need to have Bill Block in the room to reach any final conclusions, but if we could start thinking about recommendations 5 through 8. So recommendation 7, we're tabling for now. So I'd like to turn to recommendation 5. So the ACBTSA committee has received the work that BCA did with ASPR. I don't know, the working group has read this because this was part of our preparation for these recommendations, but the ACBTSA committee as a whole has not had a chance to really read through this. But it was BCA's work to outline how to develop a stockpile. So this also will probably need further discussion, but I'd like to just hear if there are any thoughts about this now, and if there are people who specifically should be on a working group to discuss this further. I'd also like to hear that. Susan.
Yeah, I just want to preface my comments with the fact I'm a medical doctor and not a supply chain expert. Although from my global medical affairs vantage point, I certainly saw some issues raised during the pandemic in terms of supply. But I had a lot of questions about this recommendation, and I can just raise some of the thoughts that I have just from my personal vantage point. One is the scope, defining all critical supplies, could be an overwhelming scope. So I think if we're going to recommend a stockpile, it would be important to define which problem we're trying to solve, and maybe narrow the scope to something that's feasible. The other, just from the field that I'm involved with, which is testing reagents that require a cold chain and that are licensed as biologic pharmaceuticals, there's some quality management issues that would need to be clarified, like who's responsible for the quality of the products that are in the stockpile, who owns them, what does that complaint management system look like, complaint investigation, just, sort of things like that. Also along the lines of ownership, what does pricing and contracting look like? So from a quality perspective, it would be simpler if the manufacturer is selling the products to the owner of that warehouse. And then that owner would be responsible for the quality of the storage and distribution. But then the question is, what does pricing look like? Because for a lot of blood bank supplies, there's tiered pricing based on volume of the end customer. So it would kind of disrupt the current pricing schedule if the products were sold to a warehouse owner. So that just, things that would need to be sort of reconciled. And the other issue is, as Sally just mentioned, some existing agreements, require manufacturers to have a certain supply available. And I think the proposal here is distributed warehouses. So I would ask how much supply is in each one. And then does the manufacturer no longer have to hold supply? So you could end up with quite a high cost if you have supply, requirements distributed as opposed to central, being held centrally. So those are just some of the thoughts.
Anyone else have thoughts? Thank you, Susan. Cassandra.
Yeah, it was sort of similar to yesterday when with the transportation, but I think this is a much more complicated issue. And I do think there need to be more, there needs to be more specifics to each piece of this, especially because things expire. And as we're talking about the bags, the reagents, the quality control part, I think is a major thing that has to be considered in this kind of stockpiling, I guess. And how would those layers be? So I would say this is a hard recommendation. I don't think we need to table it, in my opinion, to be able to define things more clearly.
So what I'm hearing is this is 2 of the 4 that deal with stockpile. We probably need, Lynn and then Sally? And Diane.
Yes, thank you. I was going to piggyback on Susan's comments, which I think are well-grounded. And I think just to reflect on it, I think Cassandra is going down the same path to really include a broader array of stakeholders in this discussion. I really appreciate all the work that BCA undertook to put this together, but I think that other blood collection facilities, such as the Red Cross, I'll just put it out there, may or may not have had an opportunity to participate in this exercise, putting things together. And I think, as Susan also mentioned, at the hospital level, the access to any aspect along the chain of blood collection, manufacturing, and distribution, if there hasn't been an opportunity for stakeholders in the hospital realm to consider what the impact may or may not be. Without that, I think we're not getting or developing the full picture from beginning to end. So,
I just would like to say that on the working group, we had representatives from ABC and the Red Cross and BCA, who were part of the discussion, and the recommendation landed as is. But that said, I appreciate that this is a highly complicated issue and deserves more time. Sally?
Yeah, Claudia, I was just going to recommend, I think when we were looking at this on the working group, it was very clear to all of us, but now that I'm reading it, I understand the concerns. I would recommend we send this back to the working group to maybe get into some additional detail and involve more people in the conversation.
Diane?
Oh, thank you. I was just going to mention that perhaps one of the things we've faced with looking at emergency preparedness requirements is that it can be very burdensome for the individual entity to have to worry about stockpiling that perhaps, but, you know, different providers can like join healthcare coalitions or form different groups such that perhaps stockpiling could be shared by a number of providers. So that might be something to think about too.
Thank you. Susan?
Yeah, I would also recommend that you include suppliers as stakeholders in this discussion because, you know, they would be impacted by this. So I think it would be important to, make sure their supply chain experts are part of the discussion. Thank you.
If I could touch base with you offline and start assembling names, I'd appreciate it. Any other comments? It sounds like we should table 5, 6. Oh, thank you, Jim.
Sorry, I've read over what BCA put in and all the manufacturers are involved. I guess it's a complex issue, but really what they're looking at is what the next questions are. So I would agree with Sally in that we should say they should continue on their work because they've loaded a number of questions which they haven't answered yet. But I think a lot of the concerns were raised. They've already had that in the report. So I'm just a little confused as to what we're going to do with this after all the work that's been done. We're not saying that they should establish it. Aren't we just saying they should go the next steps and answer the questions that they themselves have raised?
For me, I felt that BCA was plunging ahead with establishing stockpiles. And I believe, although I don't want to speak for an entity that I'm not sure, but I think Red Cross also has. But the National Strategic Stockpile does not include blood, which was surprising to me. I personally, thinking about the safety and sustainability of the blood supply, particularly during an emergency, it was of concern to me that given the weaknesses we've seen with supply chain, that we make sure that a stockpile is established, that we don't leave it entirely to the private sector, that we weigh in with recommendations that this sort of initiative be supported by the U.S. government. That was my angle on this. Ray.
Yeah, and I think that's a good angle. And I guess what I would point out is that this action item number 5 doesn't say we're going to establish a stockpile. It says we're going to create a list of what items should go into a stockpile. And you may want to, I think you've indicated that it did involve more than BCA, but it does call out their plan, which they are an organization that has a plan, which can be a starting point for discussions about what should or should not be included. I actually think putting together a list and including things like blood should be on the list, just as we spoke yesterday, is a good idea and a good starting point. Whether or not, and that consideration would go into if and when a stockpile were established, that consideration would go into what goes into that stockpile.
Susan. Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, I think one of the recommendations here was about asking for funding for initiation of a stockpile, but I didn't see anything about ongoing funding. So I think, one other thing I would recommend is that, whatever working group is working on this, consider how the ongoing costs of maintaining the stockpile, which may or may not include cold chain transportation and cold chain storage. There's going to be some real cost involved. seems like that will need to be funded somehow.
Well, we need Bill Block in the room. We need Red Cross in the room. Any other comments? Because again, as Susan said, I'm an MD also. I'm not a business person. And the business aspect of this is incredibly important. So let's table these for now. I want to thank Ray for highlighting that recommendation number 5. That's simply assembling the list. Because to me, that was the beginning. That's that first little step that I felt could be taken, but maybe we should back off and reconsider. I hope I think maybe an entire ACBTSA meeting dedicated to this topic is needed. So thank you, everybody. Let's move on. I think that we can really come up with an easy winner here if we turn to recommendation 12. Because that might be taken care of quickly and easily. And then by that time, Nicole will be back in the room and we can discuss the recommendation for which she feels some concern. So recommendation 12 deals with the Giving Equals Living campaign. We just heard a lot about this. Elisa,
yeah.
Elisa.
Yeah, this is a great campaign. As one of the members of the panel in the room mentioned, raised a question about evaluation. I was, I'll just say, I was surprised that there wasn't an evaluation component to a funded research or a funded program. And I think if I'm totally in support of continuing to fund them as long as there is an evaluation component, because otherwise we don't know if this campaign is effective. So, I would recommend that we edit this to incorporate some feature of evaluation being embedded within this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ray?
I think do 12 and 13 sort of go together, because I think it sort of addresses that issue of having the data analytics that would be used by this program to do the analysis that we're talking about. I favor 12. I think this program is incredibly important, as we've been discussing, with donor recruitment, and this is a group that's actively going after that. If you could combine that with the data analytics to say how effective are these methods being in recruiting donors, that could be very powerful.
Thank you, Ray. Jim?
Yeah, I'm concerned that what she said, there was no funding to do these analysis on the effectiveness. So what's the next step? I mean,
our recommendation to.
Yeah, I understand, but are they going to get more money, and who do they get it from? I mean, what's the process here? She said they've developed these programs, they've developed all these messages in that, but they have no funding for doing the evaluation. So if we recommended more funding, sure, that's fine that they expand and continue it. But what's the chances of getting money? Maybe Jim can enlighten us on the process here.
Jim Berger, please.
Yes, part of that recommendation should state that their funding be provided to continue with the program and do the analysis of the results. I mean, one of the things that it asked for was to increase diversity and to increase minority donations. And the program did try to push that, but there was no funds to continue to see the effectiveness on that. We know that the program was effective, but how effective it was for diversity, we do not know.
But the initial program was funded following recommendations from ACBTSA, no? So there is there is no chance of funding if we do not make this recommendation, but there is a chance if we do. And I'm very open to wordsmithing to make sure that this recommendation, these recommendations, because I agree with Elisa, and I'm sorry, I'm so bad at remembering how to pronounce names. Elisa?
Elisa.
Elisa.
Yeah.
Because I agree with Elisa and Ray that it needs to be tracked. I think it's a very difficult thing to track because there are multiple programs out there constantly trying to encourage blood donation. And so separating this campaign from another campaign, it's an important confounder. However, that said, this campaign is moving the needle forward and may be publicly used by many other blood centers to enhance their campaigns. So it's a nice effort to help with blood donations. Elisa.
Yeah, just to comment, I've HRSA has supported research in parallel to increase organ donation or signing up to become a deceased donor, and on your driver's license. And there have been a number of campaigns, quite a few that have been done in that regard, and HRSA requires evaluation being built in to their funded research program. And so all of those campaigns are feasible in terms of evaluating their effectiveness. So I don't think there should be any concern about incorporating that component into this.
Cassandra.
I also think the metric is important, but I don't think all is lost because we didn't do it before we implemented it and after we implemented it. I think there are ways to look at where the utilization was, who uptook some of the things. It sounds like with Facebook and other things, you could look at where those areas were and sort of start from there. Who is utilizing this? And I know it's not perfect, but I do think that asking for funding to come up with a plan of how we're going to look at the effectiveness of this, as well as augmentation of is valuable, and I think we should ask for the funding if they would grant it.
Thank you, Ray.
I would agree with both Elisa and Cassandra. I think that it is possible to do this, and I don't think that it's impossible to do it in retrospect, even if it's going back to some of the people that they originally made contact with to see, did they become a blood donor if they weren't one before. So there are approaches, I think, that could be utilized. I think this is an excellent program and it should be continued.
Could I have suggestions from Elisa?
Yeah, I would recommend running a new campaign and doing a prospective data collection process, pre-test, post-test, to be the most rigorous approach. That's how HRSA would do it. That's how NIH would do it. And I think we need to be as rigorous as possible with this. Certainly, the campaign has already generated some information, like that could be used as pilot data to suggest that it's worth pursuing. But I recommend we do this, that funding be made available for a prospective campaign that's evaluated. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the room? Lynn?
Yes, thank you. Two things. One, I'm wondering if 12 and 13 might be folded into a single recommendation, but I'll leave that to the group for their consideration. And I do appreciate the need for support for the data analytic aspect. And Elisa, I do appreciate your comments wanting to include the opportunity to monitor the outcome of these interventions, if you will. My question, and again, it's around language and my not fully understanding what we can put forward as recommendations, to Jim Berger. Are we able to request funding for further advocacy programs, or do we need to pull back in the language regarding this to the stance of a intervention with analytics to support whether or not it was effective? So just a question about the inclusion of the word advocacy in 13.
Thank you, Lynn. Certainly, the recommendation is open for inclusion into the recommendation. That those are things that, as the advisory committee, these recommendations go up to the secretary, and he takes the recommendation from the ACB-TSA, the wording that they put in there is what they want that recommendation to look like.
And I couldn't hear Jim very well, so I'm sure it's captioned.
Lynn, can you hear me? I think my speaker was not working well.
Yeah.
Basically, it's open to inclusion, the wording that you would like in your recommendation. That's why the advisory committees were put together for subject matter experts to identify what they would like the secretary to work on or to carry forward. So the answer to your question is yes, those recommendations could be included.
Thank you. Any other comments or discussion from the room before some wordsmithing to fold together 12 and 13 into a single recommendation and to put it together into a final form so we can vote?
I'm getting text input from third parties just to make sure that they're working with ADRP, which does very similar work, that there's not reinventing the wheel and that there's a collaborative process.
Thank you. Daryl.
Yeah, thanks. Just it's already been spoken, but just to add a vote to, I think it's really important to put the metrics onto this particular item, because again, I think we all feel that it's probably very useful and effective, but in the absence of any data to really confirm that that's true, to me, it's really hard to justify continued investment without knowing what the impact of that investment is. So it's just another vote that of the importance of measuring the impact of these efforts.
Thank you. Okay. Any other comments? So are there suggestions as to how to tighten these recommendations, put them together so that it meets the requirements of what I'm hearing in the room, which is make sure that we tie it together with research that will assess its success?
So the first line says this campaign. Can we make it more generic so that it's, that campaign that was presented was amazing. I think we need to open this up so it could be any intervention, and it could be a different kind of intervention than a campaign. So I would use more generic language like an intervention.
I'd say this pilot, or I liked your pilot idea.
Well, I was thinking of if I were that company and submitting a grant, I would use their current data as pilot data in their grant application. That's how I was thinking. I think we want to propose a formal intervention evaluation study rather than a pilot, which are distinct.
It sounds like, though, if we don't continue what we were doing, they're going to see it as a completely different entity. So the audience is not going to see it the way you're envisioning it or the way I'm envisioning it. But we still need to find a way to make it palatable and rigorous, like you say, to be able to do the study. So we need a metric, but it has to be connected to this in order for the people to fund us. Is that right? Am I hearing that?
So I think the scope of the study is contingent on the budget available to it. If it's a small scale study, then pilot would be probably more appropriate. But yeah, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. So, I mean, it could be, that's one way of thinking about it. I think we want to propose that people submit grant applications that are fully powered. I think because a pilot study means that it's not statistically powered necessarily, whereas a full intervention is statistically powered. So, and it seems like I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the person. Was it Anne who presented? It sounded like they would have plenty of data to then inform the power analysis for an application to what we're proposing next. You know, I think we want to recommend a rigorous powered study is my point.
I'm going to go on record saying something that goes against many people in the room. So I don't do this lightly, but there's very little money that has been given to these campaigns by the federal government. And the fact that they did give some money to this Giving Equals Living campaign was remarkable to me. I am normally in favor of rigorous science because that is the only way you understand whether your intervention has an effect. However, I fear that giving a lot of money for a properly conducted trial will fritter away the money that is needed to simply get ads out to promote campaigns to bring blood donors in. I also think that the market is not saturated, but is filled with competing messages, which I don't think UNOS has as much of. UNOS is a more well-controlled organization that has a tighter control, tighter rein on solid organs and their distribution. Whereas we have many different blood centers across the country, all of which have local campaigns, and distinguishing which campaign works to get a blood donor into the room is very difficult, I imagine. So I'm concerned that if we make a recommendation that requires money for an important trial, that we will lose money for just getting donors through the door. Ed.
I think at least suggesting that they work with ADRP, which has all of this tools in place to do exactly this, may help them from reinventing the wheel. There may be ADRP funds to actually do the study in collaboration.
Could you define ADRP, Jed?
Well, it used to be Association of Donor Recruiter Professionals, but they've changed their name, and it doesn't actually. So it's Association of Blood Donor Professionals, which doesn't fit in ADRP, but whatever. And they do represent the whole blood collecting industry. It's not, although it's under ABC, Red Cross is part of it.
From my understanding, and Jim, please correct me if I'm wrong, when HHS made funds available for the Giving Equals Living campaign, there was an RFA essentially that went out to the community saying, who wants to run this campaign? And one marketing group came forward and said, we want to do it. And because there were no competing bids, that's who it went to. Not that they didn't do a fine job. I think they did a fine job, but I think that's the only way to get ADRP looped into this if we get additional funds from the federal government. And not just ADRP, anyone who's out there listening who is involved with these sorts of measures. that there would, if we make a recommendation and it is followed up and we get money from HHS, then that would be how the money would be spent. So, any additional comments or thoughts about how to wordsmith this? Because I stated my opinion, but as chair, that's just one person's opinion. I of course, I believe that what the group thinks is what we need to do. Daryl?
I think I appreciate your thoughts as well. It'd be good maybe to get Jim's input in terms of how it would be perceived. So there's obviously been a certain investment in this campaign. We don't know the impact that that investment has made. And so the question would be for the audience that we would intend to submit this to, would they ask the question, well, what did you do with the first X amount of dollars that we gave you? What was the impact of your campaign? In which case, then we should probably, for the next budget request, put in there some assessment of what we're proposing. Or would they, or as you said, would the rigor of assessing the impact turn the audience away, as might have been suggested?
Thank you, Daryl. Ray?
Well, I think they have data that says with the funds that they've received so far, they are reaching an audience and they are testing different messages that are having a different impact and identifying just in terms of reaching the individuals that they're trying to reach. So the next phase of this could obviously be following up on that to say, now that they've reached out with the messages that have been identified as being the most impactful from those individuals, has that actually changed behavior? Has that converted some of those individuals who weren't blood donors into blood donors? So I see it as a natural progression of what could be done. But I think the key is recommending that the program be continued as we've been discussing. Without that, there's no point to, having the debate.
Thank you, Ray. Jim?
I wanted to add the one thing that was not brought forward or that I didn't think had been mentioned is that when Congress asked HHS to do that, they asked for a report with the results, and that report was provided to Congress and provided as much detailed in it as much as how effective it was. So maybe sharing that report with the committee members would show that it was not a report that did not take that into account.
Thank you, Jim. Jim McPherson?
Yeah, the one thing that's missing here, though, is the creation of awareness. Usually in any marketing campaign, any advertising campaign, yes, the first thing you do is measure impressions. How many people looked at this? How many people, for what, how many advertisements did you get? How many, all those statistics that she gave. And that's a measurement of success in terms of getting the message out. But then the question is, what has this moved people? Not to donate, because that's your ultimate. What you want to know is this created awareness of the need for donation among the targeted groups? And you can ask questions about how this is, will they be donors? Will they consider being donors? What are the impediments, et cetera, et cetera? And those are all research questions. That's pretty straightforward stuff. And as she said, they didn't have money to do that. And so the question is, how do you know if this program is effective unless you do that kind of research? And this is not rocket science. This is straightforward stuff that's done in any kind of advertising campaign. It's just, she admitted that they weren't funded to do that kind of follow-up. So they just measured the rollout in terms of and the rollout is somewhat impressive. I've seen much higher numbers in other candidate campaigns, but the numbers are reasonable for what it seems like the amount of money that they were given. But again, unless you know if you've got the targeted groups, you've moved them, they've got the message, then you'll never know how effective this is.
Thank you, Jim. Elisa?
Yeah, I wanted to second the point that Jim just made as far as identifying as one of the metrics awareness. of the need for blood donation. It is possible to also assess intent or willingness to donate, and that could be another metric. I've proposed a campaign myself on organ donation. And so I'm familiar with some of these metrics just in the transplant context. So there's intent, willingness, and then, all of these can kind of lead up to the actual behavior of, did you actually go ahead and donate your blood? So, it's a progression there. So, and then there are attitudes that can also be assessed, perceptions that Anne had mentioned several factors that people in her study indicated about not feeling comfortable with being a blood donor. So those kinds of attitudes should also be assessed to see whether the campaign moved the needle on those attitudes.
Thank you, Elisa. I was just reminded of an additional confounder that's very important here, and that the Giving Equals Living was blood and plasma. Now, I think everyone in the room is acutely aware of how different these two industries are, and it makes it even more difficult to assess. I thought this was going to be a gimme. I can see that it's not, which is good. It's great that we have discussions. I'm not sure we're going to have time in the next 4 minutes to wordsmith this sufficiently, but Ray?
Yeah, Claudia, in terms of the wordsmithing, I would point out that it's actually not just 12 and 13 perhaps that have to be combined, but 11 as well. Because if you read through this, the Giving Equal Living campaign comes under whereas as part of recommendation number 11. To me, these all kind of blend together, 11, 12, and 13, into recommendations, or you have to separate that out completely from a whereas to a separate point, which might incorporate points 12 and 13 as well.
That's interesting that you read it this way, Ray, because the whereas clauses above 11 were supposed to be part of 11, whereas I shouldn't have used the word whereas, but however, the whereas that begins the Giving Equals Living campaign is supposed to touch upon 12 and 13.
Are those the whereas comes first?
Yeah.
And then the recommendations 11 and 12 come after that. I didn't read it that way.
There was a recommendation to scrap the whereases, but I was told that that's sacred.
Okay. Okay.
So there really isn't time, but I do have time before my flight today. So I know what I'll be doing while I'm hanging out in DCA. I'm going to work on trying to put together language that will satisfy the discussion that I've heard for recommendations 12 and 13. I will also put together or reassemble the working group and add to it perhaps so that the stockpile idea can be further explored and recommendations can be assembled for the committee to consider. I think we have many recommendations here that we have not even begun to touch. And it is my hope, many of those that were to be priority, which is a working group needs to be assembled. I am going to release these to the committee one at a time so that people can assess them and vote and wordsmith, give me suggestions on wordsmithing. And then we can have a vote so that all to be recommendations, those that say we need to put together a working group, can be moved forward as a recommendation. These other recommendations that we haven't touched, we're going to have to table for another day in some cases. But I think we know what we have to do, don't we? And I think we have a lot of work to move forward, but I think it's important work. And I think we made a great start today and yesterday. I think that this is just the beginning of doing a lot of work, some of which has been done already, but we're taking a new approach. And I think we have a chance at moving the needle, which is the whole point. So with that,
The meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.